Right, let's face it, there was not too much hope for these horror films before they came out, due to things like poor marketing or simply the lackluster cast and crew credits. And guess what? They all ended up duly living down to expectations. Yeah, it is always nice to be surprised, especially when it comes to horror movies. So I am Gareth, this is What Culture Horror, and you right there are watching recent horror movies that everyone knew would suck. The Strangers Chapter 2. Past behavior being the most reliable indicator of future behavior, it was not remotely surprising that The Strangers Chapter 2 was another risible entry into the slasher franchise. After all, last year's glorified reboot was a dull, tension-devoid rehash of the original 2008 film, so why expect any different from this sequel, which, don't forget, was shot back-to-back with it. Even when word got out that director Renny Harlin reshot portions of the film following the vitriolic response to Chapter 1, it was still impossible to expect much good to come from it. So it was merely par the course that The Strangers Chapter 2 was another dreadfully lackluster slasher that made the fatal horror franchise mistake of demystifying the titular stalkers far too much. Like, the entire point of the original Strangers is that the villains are ciphers, and their lack of backstory and motive is what makes them scary in the first place. But this new trilogy has misguidedly attempted to flesh out their lore to wildly diminished returns. Needless to say, the only question about next year's The Strangers Chapter 3 is whether it can plumb even lower depths than its two immediate predecessors. Can't wait to find out, sure gonna be fun. Wolfman. Even though Lee Winnell seemed like an excellent choice on paper to direct a new, low-budget take on Universal's Wolfman, having, brilliantly reinvented the Invisible Man in 2020, the writing was on the wall leading up to the release that this one was, set to be a huge disappointment. For one, the trailers were thoroughly and after the titular creature's divisive new design was unveiled at Universal's Halloween Horror Nights event in October 2024, Universal suspiciously shied away from showing the Wolfman much in the subsequent marketing at all. Couple this with a mid-January release, which is rarely a good sign for horror, a late review embargo, and Universal's spoiling the full Wolfman transformation in their final trailer in a desperate attempt to boost the box office, and it was not remotely shocking at all that this one missed the mark by quite some bit. Despite solid performances from Christopher Abbott and Julia Garner, who I actually really loved in Weapons, which also came out this year, Wolfman was ultimately a woefully undercooked reboot of the classic IP that simply lacked an interesting perspective or fresh take to really justify its own existence. The Ritual. When a new horror film starring Dan Stevens and Al freaking Pacino gets dumped in a few hundred cinemas with a virtually non-existent marketing campaign, then it's probably going to be a rough ride. There was just no hype whatsoever for The Ritual, which dropped a pretty unremarkable trailer shortly before release, while reviews were noticeably absent until just a few days before it opened. And ultimately, the worst thing you can say about The Ritual is that it's just painfully boring. For despite starring one of our finest actors of all time as a German-American priest, Pacino gives a strangely subdued performance. The great many hoping that he could possibly save this film by just hamming it up for the cheap seats were left a bit disappointed, ensuring this low-energy slog of a generic exorcism movie was forgotten by just about everyone the moment it ended. A frustrating outcome, considering the inspired ecclesiastical pairing of Pacino and Stevens, but it shouldn't have really surprised anyone. Okay, before we go any further, I've got a quick question for you. What other recent horror performance left you feeling a little bit underwhelmed? And also, on the other side of that coin, which pleasantly surprised you? Yeah, let me know in the comments down below. Why not?
How's it going, everyone? You know what time of year it is. It's Black Friday week, it's busy, it's overwhelming, but lucky for you, What Culture has trolled through all of the Black Friday deals to bring you the very best offers for all your favorite streaming platforms, including Prime Video and Apple TV. Save yourself some money by checking out the link in the description and grab yourself a bargain today. Now, back to the video.
Fear Street Prom Queen. Netflix's original 3-part adaptation of R.L. Stine's Fear Street novels was a massive hit for the streamer, and so it was simply a given that more of these Fear Street things would be on the way soon enough. The 4th film in the series was later confirmed to be Fear Street Prom Queen, though expectations immediately sank once it was also announced that Lee Janik, who directed and co-wrote the 3 original films, would not be returning to helm this one. More to the point, none of the writers who worked with Janiak on that trilogy returned for prom night either. And to top it all off, the trailers also didn't really pass the vibe check, suggesting a sure drop in quality. And guess what? That is exactly what happened. I know, shocking. With a distinct lack of interesting characters and few memorable kills, while also rocking a thunderously predictable twist, this was a huge step down from Janiak's superb original trilogy. Fingers crossed that Netflix manages to course correct with the 3 additional Fear Street movies that are currently in development. Him. It's always a fair warning sign when a movie's marketing hinges on the folks who produced it, rather than, the actual director, writers, and cast, like those people. And that was certainly the case with recent sports-themed horror flick, Him, which was sold so aggressively as a Jordan Peele film that it actually ended up backfiring, suggesting a sure desperation on the part of Universal. Peele was ultimately only a producer on the film. It's still a big job, but it's not quite the director or writer, is it? Yeah, this film was developed through his production company, Monkey Paw Productions. But in creative terms, it was co-written and directed by Justin Tipping, who was also the director of Kicks. While Him certainly touted strong visuals and solid performances from Marlon Wayans and Tyreek Withers, this was largely squandered on a maddeningly undercooked, wildly on-the-nose script. It ended up feeling less like a Jordan Peele movie and more like someone just desperately trying to ape his style, almost to the point of self-parody, to be honest. Yes, the promise was definitely there, but the overzealousness with which Universal tried to tether the film to Peele's own hit movies made it very easy to be wary of this one. Now, before you go any further, be sure to tap on that subscribe button down below and you'll get plenty more of these spooky lists, reviews, editorials, and so much more in your horror-loving life. War of the Worlds. At the end of July, less than a week before it was due to release on Amazon Prime Video, a trailer dropped for a new screen-life take on H.G. Wells' sci-fi opus, War of the Worlds. While the idea had potential, yeah, for sure, the fact that it was shot in 2020 and then spent 5 years just sitting on a shelf collecting dust was then being dumped on streaming with no fanfare at all, and also starred Ice Cube, of all folk, made it hard to expect anything less than a sheer train wreck here. And indeed, War of the Worlds 2025 was an utter calamity. A horribly directed screen-life disaster, packed with naff stock footage, atrocious VFX, embarrassing Amazon product placement, and a Razzie-worthy performance from the Cube himself. It was near universally panned by critics and remains by far the worst major release of the year so far, likely ensuring that many Razzies will be in its future, as just about anyone who saw the trailer before release could have anticipated. This one stank. The Woman in the Yard. The marketing for The Woman in the Yard made it almost feel like a parody of your typical high-concept Blumhouse horror flick. Between the title and the premise, revolving around a spectral woman sitting in a chair outside a house, it felt like a hilariously thin setup for a feature film. Like, okay, is that it? The trailers made it look like another purely generic romp from the studio, compounded by the fact that it was helmed by workaday filmmaker Jaume Collet-Serra, who, you will remember, directed Black Adam, and the review embargo did not lift until release day either, and that's also not the best sign. Unsurprisingly then, The Woman in the Yard turned out to be a soulless nothing burger of a supernatural horror, which even a committed performance from Danielle Deadwyler was unable to save. By the midpoint, this one is an absolute snoozer, suggesting that it probably would have functioned better as a punchy 10 to 15 minute short rather than a soporific 87-minute feature. Despite the broad nature of its premise, though, this was a rare underperformance for Blumhouse, with the film failing to even double its small $12 million budget at the box office. Screamboat. Since the release of Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey back in 2023, we have seen a glut of horror films cashing in on recognizable IP that are now in the public domain. A trend that's basically worn itself out in record time. Marvelous. So it was tough not to roll one's eyes at Screamboat, a slasher film based on the original Steamboat Willie iteration of Mickey Mouse. If you can make it through the trailer alone without groaning hard once, then well, more power to you. But the extent to which the marketing clearly leaned on the quasi-Disney branding without bringing much fresh to the table made it seem like an especially cynical cash grab, which is precisely what it was. Shocking. Though Terrifier's David Howard Thornton gives a solid performance in the lead role, he did what he could. This is basically a mildly amusing concept for a short film that is excruciating at feature length. And talking of length, steady now, it is also 102 minutes for some reason. That's how long it is. When something this thin desperately needed to be cleaved to, say, 80 at most. The Conjuring Last Rites. Though The Conjuring is the most commercially successful horror franchise of, all time, it is fair to say that the whole enterprise has felt tired for a good while now. Without the sturdy hand of James Wan, who directed the original 2 movies, of course, the Conjuring IP has been largely trotting out forgettable, also-ran studio horror flicks for the better part of a decade now. And while The Conjuring Last Rites was sold as the final entry in the mainline franchise, most possibility of a rousing finale was stymied by the announcement that it was being directed by Michael Chavez. You know, who helmed 3 mediocre prior Conjuring films: The Curse of La Llorona, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, and The Nun 2. Why expect anything but another moldy, dull effort then? Despite game performances from Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson, once again, those two just work together, don't they? Last Rites is an oppressive slog of a farewell to the Warrens, with a staggering lack of atmosphere, an undercooked antagonist, and a brutally overlong 135-minute runtime. That is so many minutes. But because it also became the highest grossing film in the series to date, do not be shocked if The Conjuring 5 materializes within a few years. This is just how these things work, folks. Hellboy the Crooked Man. Now, in fairness, Hellboy fans had their pitchforks out for Hellboy the Crooked Man from the moment it was announced, considering that it was not the Guillermo del Toro-directed Hellboy 3 that they actually wanted. But everything we knew about the Crooked Man pre-release made it seem cooked anyway. The mere $20 million budget was apparent in how agonizingly cheap the trailers looked, and there wasn't much enthusiasm for Jack Hesse's casting in the lead role, nor the rather lackluster makeup job compared to those applied to Ron Perlman and David Harbour in prior iterations. On top of all this, the film wasn't even given a theatrical release in the US, instead going straight to VOD, which is a kiss of death if ever there was one, right? While it's clear that the cast and crew gave it their level best to do Hellboy on a budget, they were ultimately overcome by a flabbergasting lack of resources, ensuring that it ended up looking like a relatively upmarket fan film, really. But basically, rubbish by Hollywood standards. Like, what are we doing? Number 10, The Home. Much as filmmaker James DeMonico has enjoyed massive success with the Purge franchise, where he served as either writer or director on every entry, his other directorial work has been received with considerably less enthusiasm. 2021's drama This Is the Night was widely panned by critics, and so expectations were basement low for his latest movie, The Home. A retirement home set horror starring Pete Davidson, even accepting the rather bizarre left-field casting of Davidson in a horror film. The trailers made it look cheap and tossed off, and that is precisely what it is. Get your head out the gutter, you know what I meant. Aside from an amusingly bonkers final 10 minutes, this is a snoozer of a horror flick that has earned unfavorable comparisons to Jordan Peele's Get Out, which it feels like a dusty facsimile of, really. Then there's Davidson, who simply lacks the chops to carry a picture like this. But to be completely fair to him, it's DeMonico's weak writing and direction that doomed The Home from the jump. He did what he could, Pete. He had a go. Time cut. The moment that the trailer dropped for Netflix's time travel slasher flick Time Cut, many immediately called it out as a knockoff of Totally Killer, the almost identically premised horror film released on Amazon Prime Video the year before. While that definitely didn't get Time Cut's marketing run off to the best start, the truth is that it was actually shot almost an entire year before Totally Killer, though spent more than 3 years in post-production before finally landing last Halloween. Even accepting this, however, the trailer absolutely made Time Cut look like a lesser iteration of Totally Killer, and the lack of gore featured in the marketing further suggested it to be a dispiritingly tame slasher. Ultimately, the film was largely panned for its uneven attempts at comedy, generally mediocre script, unremarkable exploitation of early 2000s nostalgia, and yes, an almost total lack of blood. Now, while it wasn't really fair to call Time Cut a rip-off of Totally Killer, it was nevertheless vastly inferior. The Crow. 2024's take on James O'Barr's legendary The Crow is a quintessential nobody asked for this movie. Though Alex Proyas' 1994 movie adaptation was a solid critical and commercial success, there just wasn't anyone on this planet crying out for a new take on this IP. It is barely an overstatement to suggest that this one had more red flags than cast and crew members. For one, the reboot was in development for almost 16 years before finally being released, during which period it passed through the hands of numerous filmmakers and lead actors who ultimately thought better of it. Then there's the fact that it was being helmed by anonymous journeyman director Rupert Sanders, featured pop star FKA Twigs in the lead female role, and was clearly fashioned as a John Wick-esque reinvention of the franchise. None of this turned the already dire tide of public opinion on the movie, which was a critical and commercial failure, all while 94 director Proyas publicly called it a cynical cash grab. Yikes. On the plus side though, The Crow 2024 bombed hard enough that it's unlikely any studio will try to resurrect the franchise in blockbuster form anytime soon, so we're safe for a little while at least. Hell House LLC Lineage. The Hell House LLC found footage franchise has been all over the map quality-wise, with the first and fourth films receiving solid acclaim, while the second and third were largely panned. For the series' fifth and final film, writer-director Stephen Cognetti boldly opted to shift away from found footage entirely, having Hell House LLC Lineage unfold in a more conventional cinematic style. It's a choice that left many fans of the franchise immediately skeptical, especially as Cognetti's previous non-found footage film, 825 or 825, whatever the hell it is, Forest Road, was generally poorly received. And so it wasn't much of a shock that Hell House LLC Lineage just might be the worst film in the series yet. A tedious, generic horror outing with a patent lack of atmosphere, uneven performances, and a brutally overlong 108-minute runtime. It's quite sad to see a once promising franchise bow out like this. Assuming that it actually does, of course, we know what horror movies are like. But given the 50-50 quality of the series up to this point, it was hardly unexpected. Shocked we were not. Popeye The Slayer Man. Not content for Screamboat to take the crown for most craven horror cash-in, we have Popeye The Slayer Man, a film which cannot possibly live up to its admittedly rather hilarious title. The trailer at least didn't try to dress it up as anything that it isn't, but evidently trying to shift attention away from its poor writing and acting by focusing on the gory deaths of almost every major character. But when you're giving away too much of the good stuff for free, that's just never a good sign at all. As with most of these movies, there's very little going on beyond the mildly amusing juxtaposition of taking an iconic children's character and turning them into a murderous psychopath. That's about it, really. Mind-bogglingly, this was the most mainstream of 3 Popeye-centric slashers released this year. Yes, 3. The other 2 being Popeye's Revenge and Shiver Me Timbers, all of which were largely panned by critics and general horror fans alike. The platform too. 2019's dystopian sci-fi horror film, The Platform, became an overnight sensation when it launched on Netflix in March 2020, with its politically charged, confined setting proving extremely timely for viewers stuck at home during an early stage of the pandemic. The strong reviews and gangbusters viewing figures ensured that a second film was swiftly confirmed. No matter that The Platform well and truly felt like a one-off that didn't in any way need a sequel. And everything in the marketing for The Platform 2 made it just feel like the same movie all over again. A perfunctory follow-up that had almost certainly reaped diminished returns. It was so very clear that this film only got the green light because the first massively overperformed relative to Netflix expectations, that they would have simply been leaving money on the table to not exploit its viewership success. Predictably, The Platform 2 was a pale shadow of its predecessor, being sillier than the first and mostly lacking its charm, while committing the egregious sin of over-explaining a scenario that is just better left ambiguous. The Deliverance. Lee Daniels, director of Precious and The Paperboy, is a maddeningly inconsistent filmmaker, so there was more morbid curiosity than genuine excitement when he decided to dip a toe in the horror genre for his new film, The Deliverance. Despite Daniels' unique filmmaking perspective, the marketing largely sold this as just another by-the-numbers, also-ran exorcism movie with a dubious basis in true events. Even with the presence of Oscar nominees Glenn Close, Andra Day, and Anjanou Ellis-Taylor, as well as Oscar winner Monique, the trailer could not disguise how obviously this was absolute schlock that might be lucky enough to be embraced as camp by some audiences. By attempting to be both a serious-minded drama about trauma and a more heightened horror film, The Deliverance satisfied as neither, pulling itself between two distinct tones in a manner that doesn't cohere at all. Now, at least Glenn Close was clearly having fun, so, it wasn't a total loss. But considering the talent in front of and behind the camera, what a mess this was. Bloat. There's no two ways about it. The trailers for Bloat made it look like a particularly ropey attempt at the divisive screen life horror subgenre. It also didn't help that the marketing desperately focused on it being produced by the folks behind screen life hits Unfriended and Searching, like, remember these? You like these, right? And on top of this, it was distributed by the schlock factory that is Grindstone Entertainment. While there was definitely potential for a horror movie centered around the Japanese water spirit known as Kappa, Bloat simply failed to make a dent. Roughly assembled, acted with indifference by its cast, and failing to raise the pulse much at all. This is an almost instantly forgettable outing that simply does nothing interesting with either its technical presentation or its central folklore. In the very least, Bloat had the good grace to release quietly and unceremoniously slink off into the pop culture ether without most even being aware of its existence, until you heard about it here, so you're welcome for that. I Know What You Did Last Summer. Though Sony was clearly trying to give I Know What You Did Last Summer a legacy sequel treatment in the vein of 2022's Scream, the important distinction is that this slasher franchise has never actually been good to begin with. Much as the original 1997 film was a box office hit and has endured as a cult favourite amongst horror fans, it's more of a guilty, trashy pleasure than genuinely great genre classic on the level of the first Scream. And so, a dew-eyed, belated sequel which peered back over its shoulder at the original film wasn't hugely appealing from the outset, even with talented filmmaker Jennifer Caton Robinson at the helm. The trailers really failed to sell this one as a worthwhile follow-up that would sufficiently exploit fans' desire to see Jennifer Love Hewitt and Freddie Prinze Jr. back in the franchise again. That's because the film is a generic rehash of what came before, predictably shoehorning the legacy characters into the story while giving them little worthwhile to actually do. And this is without even getting into the movie's deeply dopey, fan-base alienating third act twist, which was at least so out of left field that nobody could have seen it coming. So that's something, I guess. I don't know. Afraid. And finally, there is no single stronger indication of a film being absolutely terrible than the fearful words not screened for critics. uh-oh. If the studio won't show a film to the press before release day, then it's damn near guaranteed that a dud is on the horizon. As of course turned out to be the case with last year's AI-centric horror, Afraid! Even with the talented Chris White serving as writer-director with a strong cast including the likes of John Cho and Catherine Waterston, everything in the film's trailers made this just look like a breezy paycheck gig for all involved. Beyond this, there's the suspiciously short 84-minute runtime, possibly indicating a movie that was cut to within an inch of its life during post-production. I mean, at least it wasn't too long for a change. And then there's the simple fact that studio Blumhouse was on a cold streak of terrible releases at the time. Despite its timely premise, Afraid failed to do anything interesting with it, squandering a top-draw cast in the process. Even with Blumhouse's low-budget production model allowing even their worst films to turn a profit, Afraid is a rare example of one that also tanked commercially, confirming how it failed to appeal to even the most undemanding of genre fans.